This is a more thorough technique. It takes at least an hour for moderately important strategic initiatives, and of course longer if you want to make a major strategic initiative. So choosing to go for that new direction in the intelligence agency that's opening up or not, choosing not to, both of those are important decisions. So defending your future, you want to use this technique for those sorts of things. First, decide in the scope and the goals. So what is the area that you're assessing? You can make this for a whole strategic plan for your company. So that leadership retreat Amy was mentioning during the breakout session, for a strategic retreat, that's going to be a broad area. Or you can make it for a narrow area, like, do we go for this new orientation in the intelligence community or not? Or how do we approach our hiring, since that's an issue? Or how do we do the cultural tensions that are between the Americans and the French? And that can be a strategic area. And the scope, of course. So the area and the scope. What is the scope of the project? What are you taking on? And then the strategic goals. What is your vision? What do you want to be different about the company, around your team, after you go through this process? That's a really important aspect. If you want to integrate a learning culture, you want to have a vision of how the company will be different from how it is right now to how it will be after this initiative. And that's definitely a strategic initiative, a culture change, if you want to make your company have much more of a learning culture. Then the timeline. So 6 to 60 months, I really recommend not going beyond the 60 months. Don't do a 10-year plan. That we really have difficulty predicting what's going on after the 5-year timeline. And we have the most effectiveness within the 6-month timeline. Then longer timeline, if you go toward the 60-month timeline, you know you're going to have less accuracy. So you'll need more resources to address uncertainty. Then gather your stakeholders. I strongly recommend no more than 4 to 6 people, no more than 10 people. I was having a strategic retreat to pivot a company, 500 people company. It's $1.4 billion in September for COVID. So strategic pivot for COVID. And their leadership team was 6 people, but they wanted to include not simply their leadership team, but their next level team, which would be about 25 more people. 30 people in the room, not good, not good. So eventually negotiate to have 8 people in the room. So leadership team and 2 more people. You don't want more than 10 people. You want a balance of expertise and authority. Expertise and authority. You have a strategic plan, that's broad, mostly about authority. If you're deciding to go into this new direction with the intelligence agency or not, you want to have people with some expertise on this decision, even though they might not have too much authority in the company. You consider recruiting an independent facilitator. So Pete might be a great person to recruit, or someone from the Vistage group or somebody else. So obviously, so whatever you want to do, whoever serves as a good independent facilitator for you. Next. What's your anticipated future? What if the future goes as you anticipate without any major changes? Everything goes according to plan. How many resources would you require? So let's say the new direction, the intelligence agency goes great, everything's fine. How many resources would you require for that situation? Then unanticipated problems. So what can be the kind of problems that you don't anticipate coming up? Write these out anonymously, write them out anonymously. I had a situation, not with a strategic pivot for this company, but with a product launch assessment where somebody wrote that this product launch will fail because the VP of operations hates the guts of the VP of sales. And that's not something that would have been said in the room very openly. That's a political issue. So you want something where you have an opportunity to write out problems anonymously. That's why independent facilitator like Pete, another Vistage member, someone like that is very helpful. Estimate the likelihood and the impact of each problem, and then determine the most serious ones. So what's the likelihood of each problem occurring? What is the impact of each occurring? So let's say if you're having the driving is the biggest risk for you, what is the likelihood of accidents occurring? What is the impact of each accident? What would be the cost of addressing these issues? And then brainstorm solutions. So with more defensive driving, there are many things that you can do to address that. Identify what kind of resources you need to solve these problems, and update your strategic plan with this new information, including these resources that you would need to solve these problems. Then unanticipated opportunities. It's not only the problems, there can be opportunities that come up. You want to write them out anonymously as well, and estimate the likelihood and the impact of each. So for example, the company that was doing the strategic pivot in September, they are a sales engagement software company. And so what they decided to do as part of their opportunity was to create for their customers who they help with their sales to create a pivot package for them to help their customers pivot as part of COVID and in general pivot as a package, so an upsell. And that turned out to be an opportunity that they decided to pursue. That was a very promising one, and brainstorm ideas on how to bring them about and seize them, identify the resources needed. So they took some resources from their existing product development to develop this, and they update the strategic plan with this new information. And from what I'm learning about their launch of this new strategic pivot, offering for their customers, it's really quite successful. Then look at the dangerous judgment errors. So we talked about the dangerous judgment errors using the assessment, so you learn about them. If there's no opportunity to use the assessment for some reason, check for some of the most common ones. Loss aversion is a big one. We tend to avoid losses more than we want gains. You know, dollar lost and dollar gained gives us the same bottom line, but we're much more averse to losing a dollar than to gaining a dollar. It's irrational, but that's how it is. Status quo bias. We tend to be oriented toward where we are right now and not be willing to launch changes because of anxiety, uncertainty, not wanting to change our existing plans. That's the status quo bias. Talked about the confirmation bias. Attentional bias. We tend to pay attention to what's most emotionally salient, what draws us the most in our environment, regardless of whether that's the most important thing or not. Then overconfidence. We talked about the overconfidence bias. That's a big one. Optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, horns effect. So we talked about these. Next, unknown unknowns. Think about unknown unknowns. So Jim was talking about him being in the Pentagon. I'm sure he knows Donald Rumsfeld's idea of these unknown unknowns. You know, it's the unknown unknowns that will get you, not the known unknowns, also called black swans. And scan your environment for these major disruptors. So the pandemic, of course, COVID-19, huge disruptor. And most businesses, the large majority of them, were not prepared for the pandemic. If you look at the vast majority of businesses, what they use to protect themselves from disruptors is business continuity insurance. Well, business continuity insurance is essentially property casualty insurance. It only works if your property suffers damage, not for something like the pandemic. So they're not prepared, they weren't prepared for the pandemic, and they didn't get insurance payouts. There were a number of businesses that chose to get a pandemic rider on their insurance, and they are making out quite fine in the pandemic because they're protected and their insurance is paying them out due to the interruption in their business. So that's something that you can look at and evaluate. Okay, what is insurance offering? What are these riders that they're offering and not? What are important thought leaders like Bill Gates saying? He was predicting a pandemic for quite a while. So you can scan your environment and you can take steps to address them. And this doesn't only apply to you, that this applies to your key stakeholders. So if you're providing, let's say, government services for the intelligence agency or other sorts of services for their companies, what might be impacting them? What might be causing them to have changes, disruptors? What can impact them that can impact your business? And decide on the resources you'll need to address this. So for example, of course, with the pandemic insurance, if you decide, okay, we should buy that rider, the pandemic rider for our insurance, that's the way to address that. But you can't account for all events. You don't have riders for all events. You know, solar flare that takes out our communication for 2 weeks. That's not something that insurance companies offer a rider for. So you need to have a cash cushion in reserve. About 40%, what the research on this topic shows, it should be about 40% of what you use for other unknown unknowns. So when you identify, here are the kind of unknown unknowns, major disruptors, after you go through that process, you add 40% and keep that in the bank of whatever you identify. So if you have, let's say, you identify, you know, you need 200,000 for all of these other riders for your strategic plan for the next 5 years. So that's what you need. Then you want to reserve 80 more thousand just for your bank to have a cash cushion. And consider how to make your plans more resilient and flexible. There's definitely ways of doing that, and that will help you address unknown unknowns. And finally, communicate and take the next steps. Communicate effectively about the results of this exercise to all stakeholders, reserve the resources you need, and take the next steps. All right. Now, let's go into the breakout rooms. So I'll give you about 5 minutes to discuss this and see what are your thoughts about this. and then we'll get back to a broad discussion. So a little bit shorter than the previous one, 5 minutes.
The guitars and yeah, being very harmonious, understanding.
We definitely don't have the egos you're talking about, but I have seen them because, you know, I do work with NIH.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not naive to what you're describing.
No, it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's it's a challenge. So dealing with these egos.
Yeah. For sure.
Let's talk about these techniques. What are your thoughts?
I've been sort of preoccupied with, you know, sort of this idea that I need to have a one-to-one with Mike, our president, after this, and just get on the same page with. I think what I've sort of been noticing is it's a combination of the, you know, he's very confident in himself, and I think he has right to be. I mean, we've done very well since March under his, or April since his, you know, him assuming that, but sort of getting on the same page with, you know, getting ahead in this regard and sort of working this into our process. And I anticipate sort of like you know, we're kicking ass and taking names. Why are you assigning work to me? You know, because I'm doing work, and you know, and so just getting on the same page with about that, and I think that's been my larger challenge with our new organizational structure is, you know, I only am really managing 2 people, but they are considerably more challenging to. They don't require a lot of management, but then when I go to dig into something or question something, the way they respond is a lot different. So I just need to nip it in the bud.
It's a wise idea. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing you say, so there are both 2 things that I'm hearing you say. One is an object level challenge and one is a meta challenge. The object level challenge is how to institute these methodologies into your organization. Because everything is going well, and so people, you know, president will say, Mike will say, we're doing great. Why are you bothering me? I think that's a very fundamentally flawed and not strategic way of thinking, because the time to improve your organization is always when things are going well. You can't improve it when things are, you know, when you're in a crisis. In a crisis is the time to deal with a crisis. What you want to do when things are going well is anticipate fires and put the fires out in advance. It takes so many less resources to put out a fire in advance than to put out a fire. It's like Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's a culture that's very important to integrate into the organization, especially the leadership team. Each of your leaders, Ben, needs to be thinking that way. When things are going well, when there isn't a fire I'm currently putting out, I need to be working on anticipating and addressing future fires, which includes making sure that I take advantage of opportunities as well as prevent problems. So that needs to be a fundamental aspect of the organization's culture, that what am I doing right now? Prevent fires, seize opportunities, address problems, you know, anticipated problems and seize opportunities. So that's, if your people, especially the top people, aren't thinking that way, I think that's definitely a culture issue that I would strongly encourage you to work on. And there's a different issue on kind of the personal relationship with these folks and them feeling too empowered and not willing to work with you and collaborate with you. And I think this approach, this kind of changing culture to address threats in advance, which you're clearly doing, right? But you seem like you're the only one in the organization who is thinking that way. Or maybe there are others, but you seem to be kind of in this position, especially if the people at the top aren't. I think this will also help take care of the relationship issue with people not being willing to be questioned, because it comes from complacency. They feel everything is going well. They're not future oriented, and they're not taking care of the problems before they're happening.
I was going to say the same thing, is like, no better time than the present to say that we're going to be an organization that questions everything because we can't predict the future. I mean, here we are in this future that no one could predict. And let's be future focused and challenge our assumptions and constantly be vigilant about thinking about these things and just build it into who we are as an organization.
Yep. And that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure could be a fundamental aspect of culture kind of motto. That is a really good way of thinking going forward. And that's a way that people understand, you know.
Yes.
I mean, the way you describe this, Dr. Gleb, when I think about the strategic planning process, I mean, I've done, since I've been with my organization for just over 2 years now, I've had to present the several iterations of the 5-year plan to the board of directors. And the company's gone through a fairly large strategic change over the last 2 years. And so that strategic planning process has been very much a constant scenario that I've been working with. And the way you described this, it resonates very strongly around, well, a lot of this is strategic planning that you're describing here. And when I break down the strategic planning process I've been going through over the last 2 years, it does talk to a lot of this. So I think it's just good reinforcement. And certainly what I struggle with, though, actually, one thing you talked on, two things you talked on, which was interesting to me, you're getting the stakeholders together. You have your leadership team and you have the extended leadership team. And I have a dynamic right now in my organization where a lot of the extended leadership team are clamoring to be on the leadership team. So the way I look at it, I have a global leadership team, which takes the general managers from my French organizations, the GM from my US organization, global head of sales, CFO. That's really the most senior level of business. But then on each site, I have obviously another level of management now, constantly clamoring to be on this so-called global leadership team. And you don't want to necessarily demoralize people by saying no. So you try and bring them in for maybe special projects. You maybe invite them in to present. They may be sitting on that leadership team for a particular project, but it's getting that balance between motivating and not diluting all the decision making.
What is quite helpful in that sort of situation, you might be already doing this, so tell me if you are, is to have strategic planning for those units as part of a broader strategy. So here's the broader strategy for the company. How will your department define or orient toward not simply implementing the strategy, but developing its own strategy within this broader plan, and have them go through the exact same process. Okay, here's the broader company strategy. How will we fit into it? How will our department develop our strategy in the context of this broader company strategy? This process, that's Defend Your Future, goes for this very well. It addresses the same thing. It's kind of, here are the scope and goals, because the scope and goals need to fit within that. But there's many ways that each business unit can accomplish the broader strategy of the company. So you want that local leadership unit to also go through its own strategic planning process.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So to finish up the discussion, we'll be closing up in 60 seconds, but welcome to finish up the discussion, address other things that you want to address. So Jarf, I hope that's been helpful. That answer is helpful.
Thank you.
And then, of course, you can see who in those teams performs best in those local leadership processes as a way of grooming the next generation of leaders. Because, there are some people who think they should be on the leadership team who really shouldn't be on the leadership team.
No, for sure. For sure. Okay.
Waiting for, I think, one more person. Okay, everyone's here. Great. So what are your insights and questions that you have about this process from the discussions and just your pondering of it?
One person in our breakout was lamenting the fact that they didn't have the caliber of people that should be, he would like to have this conversation with. So that just points out something to pay attention to.
That's important to realize, that sometimes some folks are not going to be a good fit for a leadership role. You can, however, get them involved in various aspects of the process. And I'm telling you that they can address things. And I've heard this before. What they can do is they contribute to the unanticipated problems and unanticipated opportunities section really well. Because when they're experts in an area, that's something that they can contribute, and they can be surprisingly helpful. So it's kind of people with expertise. And of course, you want people with authority as well to make those decisions. So that would be something to look at. Also, that's a way of developing people, including them in the process. So if you have a certain leadership team and then you're getting a couple of other people, you're developing their higher level thinking about this as they go through the process. So they learn this process thinking, and that I would recommend, and that's been quite helpful for a lot of folks right now, for a lot of clients.
Gleb, this is Jim Shannon. The other thing that I mentioned is when you, I fully agree with trying to keep it in a controllable situation for your strategic decision making, but somebody eventually, always somebody feels disenfranchised. Even if you go, I'm going with 6+2 or 8+2, there's always one more who believes they should be in that position. And I've tried to reach out to those kind of people. In one case, the person just left the company. He had a very narrow level of subject matter expertise, but he was the expert in one thing. And it actually has hurt us a little bit. So because he left with all the information and nobody knows how to do what he did. So that one extra person who's disfranchised, how do you address that?
It's a difficult issue, and I think you want to have a process for selecting people. So the way that you address that is to make sure that there's a clear and transparent selection of people for the gathering stakeholders. The crucial thing is that people feel it's fair and that there's a process where their concerns are heard. If they feel that it's just subjective, just Jim kind of, just snapping his fingers and deciding you're in or out, that will be a negative. They'll feel the attention, they'll feel not cared for, they'll feel disrespected. But if there's a process where you go for, okay, here are the standards that we use for who's going to be included, for who's not going to be included in this meeting, and maybe the standards for next one, not shifting the standards, will mean that you will be included because your expertise is more relevant or something like that. You will have a process that will help people decide, feel enfranchised, feel that it's fair. It's all about fairness when you go for the decision-making process and how people respond to it. They